Welcome to the Maybe Not So Great Books channel, You Decide. This is lesson 5 of 14, How Institutions Die. The Unraveling Nobody Notices, from the Fourth Turning. Generational Theory Across 3 Decades, by Neil Howe and William Strauss. The most dangerous moment in a civilization's life is not the crisis. It is the 30 years before the crisis, when everyone is too comfortable to notice that the foundations are rotting.
Yeah, that's a really heavy thought to start on, but it's exactly what we need to get into today.
All right, and if you are tuning in right now, you are probably someone who is, trying to make sense of the historical moment we find ourselves in. You want the actual underlying frameworks that explain all this noise, not just another regurgitation of the daily headlines.
Exactly.
So our focus for this deep dive isolates one specific highly controversial season of history from Neil Howe and William Strauss's broader generational theory. We are putting a magnifying glass entirely on what they call the third turning.
The unraveling phase.
Yeah, the unraveling. We're looking at how a society quietly dismantles its own civic infrastructure while simultaneously throwing an unprecedented party to celebrate its economic and cultural success.
Which is such a wild contradiction when you think about it. It forces a complete reevaluation of what societal decline actually looks like. I mean, we have this culturally ingrained assumption that civilizational collapse is a loud cinematic event.
Oh, for sure. Like asteroids or zombies.
Right, or we picture stockbrokers jumping out of windows on Wall Street in 1929, or invading armies or sudden global catastrophes. But Strauss and Howe present a much more insidious framework here. The decay does not start with a dramatic explosion. It starts when people are feeling completely insulated from historical tragedy.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this counterintuitive truth is the hook of their entire argument. The society is wealthiest, the individual feels the most liberated, consumer choice is at an absolute peak, and yet structurally, the civilization is hollowing itself out.
It's fascinating, and to place this in time, Howe and Strauss argue the most recent American unraveling spanned roughly from 1984 to 2005.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so just consider the cultural atmosphere of that era. We start right in the middle of Ronald Reagan's Morning in America campaign. The economy is booming. The Cold War ends with the fall of the Berlin Wall. The personal computer revolutionizes the home. The dot-com bubble creates unprecedented wealth.
Right.
And the era stretches all the way through the pop culture optimism of the 1990s and right up into the aftermath of September 11.
It's the era of neon windbreakers,
Yeah.
The birth of the consumer internet and the unquestioned dominance of Western liberal democracy. I always think of Francis Fukuyama famously publishing The End of History and The Last Man in 1992.
Oh, absolutely.
He was basically arguing that we had figured it all out. Free market capitalism and representative democracy were the final form of human government. We had won the game.
And that sentiment perfectly captures the paradox of comfort. During an unraveling, cultural individualism peaks. There is a massive celebration of the self, of personal branding, of breaking free from the suffocating conformity of the previous decades.
The me generation stuff.
Exactly. But underneath that glittering surface, institutional trust is quietly evaporating. The shared civic infrastructure, the things that allow a society to actually execute large, unified projects, is decaying.
Because the public just doesn't feel the urgency to maintain it anymore.
That's it.
It is like throwing an incredibly lavish party in a historic mansion. The champagne is flowing, the music is incredible, everyone feels fantastic, but down in the basement, termites are eating through the load-bearing beams. Nobody notices the termites because the party is simply too engaging.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. And this raises an important question. Think back to the 1990s. Did it feel like the edge of a cliff, or did it feel like a permanent plateau of success?
It felt like a plateau. It felt like things were just going to get better forever.
Right. And Howe and Strauss argue that this blindness is a built-in feature of the historical cycle. The people living through it unraveling are structurally incapable of seeing the danger. Why? Because the very institutions that would sound the alarm, the government, the press, the established academies, are the exact institutions they are actively dismantling in the name of personal freedom.
To really grasp how this operates, we need to map out the anatomy of this theory for you. What makes a third turning a third turning?
We have to start with their concept of the cyclical, which is a roughly 80 to 100-year historical cycle. It basically represents the length of a long human life.
And just as a year has 4 seasons, a cyclical has 4 turnings.
Yes, each lasting about 2 decades. So the first turning is a high, akin to spring. that's characterized by strong institutions and weak individualism. And then the second turning is an awakening, the summer, bringing spiritual upheaval and a rebellion against those strong institutions.
Then comes the third turning, the unraveling, which is the autumn of the cycle.
Exactly. The leaves are brilliant colors, but they are dying and falling from the branches. Winter is coming. During this autumn phase, trust in institutions collapses. People stop believing in their government, their media, and their corporate leaders.
The culture just fragments.
It fragments into niche groups, elevating personal autonomy to the highest moral good. And consequently, society loses its capacity for collective action. The public square is just completely abandoned.
I kept thinking of an everyday analogy to ground this. Imagine a sports franchise that won a historic championship a decade ago.
Okay, I like this.
The original players who won that title, the ones who endured grueling training camps, who sacrificed their egos for the team, who implicitly trusted their coach, they have all aged out and retired. Now the roster is filled with a new generation.
Right.
These new players are incredibly talented, maybe even more individually skilled than the veterans, but they grew up watching the championship highlight reels. They take the franchise's prestige as an absolute given.
So their focus shifts.
Exactly. Their focus shifts to their individual statistics, their personal highlight tapes, and securing their own shoe contracts. The franchise is still incredibly wealthy. For merchandise sales, the stadium is packed every night, but the team can no longer win a championship. They have lost the invisible underlying cohesion that made victory possible in the first place.
The generational mechanics Howe and Strauss outline mirror that sports team perfectly. The generation that built the mid-century institutions, the GI generation who endured the Great Depression and fought World War II, are dying off during the unraveling.
The veterans.
Yeah, they are the veterans who built the interstate highway system and established the post-war corporate consensus. But the generations replacing them, primarily the baby boomers and Generation X, came of age in a completely different environment. They were raised inside the security provided by those very institutions.
Right.
And because they never experienced the lack of that security, they perceived the institutions not as protectors, but as oppressive bureaucratic obstacles to their personal fulfillment.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This brings us to what might be the most profound sociological concept in their entire framework. In their earlier work, Generations, they introduce the endowment cycle.
Yes, the endowment cycle is crucial because it explains the actual mechanics of civilizational forgetting. Societies do not lose competencies because of some collective amnesia. They lose competencies because the specific generational cohort that carried that knowledge in their bones physically ages out of the workforce and dies.
Knowledge is essentially biological in this framework. Each generation has a distinct legacy, an endowment. And the GI generation's endowment was massive institutional building and the execution of vast collective infrastructure projects.
Consider the Apollo program. The generation that managed Apollo possessed a very specific type of institutional DNA. They knew how to coordinate hundreds of thousands of contractors using slide rule engineering, applying top-down military-style hierarchical discipline to achieve a singular national goal.
Getting a man on the moon.
Right. But they did not pass that specific organizational muscle memory to their successors. When the boomers and Gen X took over the management layers of American society, they brought entirely different skills. They brought flat hierarchies, a focus on software over hardware, decentralization, and cultural critique.
Which is great for some things.
Totally. You can build Silicon Valley with a move fast and break things mentality. You cannot build a Saturn V rocket with it.
The knowledge of how to coordinate the Saturn V literally retired to Florida and passed away. You see this same dynamic with financial regulation too.
Oh, the financial regulatory framework is the perfect example of the endowment cycle in action. The rules constructed in the 1930s laws, like the Glass-Steagall Act, the creation of the FDIC, were drafted by legislators and economists who had visceral, terrifying memories of bank runs and total economic collapse.
They saw the destruction firsthand.
Yes. But by the time we reached the late 1990s, during the peak of the unraveling, those regulations were systematically dismantled. The politicians and bankers leading the deregulation in 1999 had never lived through a systemic banking collapse.
Right. The generation that held the memory of why the rules existed was just gone.
Gone. The new leadership looked at the guardrails and simply saw inefficient red tape obstructing quarterly profits.
To really see this shift from we to me, In real time, you don't even have to look at abstract policy. You just have to look at the American factory floor. Look at what happened with the Treaty of Detroit.
The Treaty of Detroit is the quintessential institutional bargain of the first turning. That was the high following World War II. In 1950, General Motors and the United Auto Workers, led by Walter Reuther and GM's Charles Wilson, signed a landmark 5-year contract.
And it was massive.
Unprecedented. GM agreed to huge concessions, guaranteed cost of living adjustments, robust pensions, and comprehensive health benefits. And in return, the union guaranteed labor peace and ceded control over management decisions.
It was an incredible moment of consensus. Both labor and management essentially shook hands and agreed to share the prosperity to build the American middle class. They tied the workers' fate directly to the company's fate.
But look at the trajectory of that consensus. By the time the unraveling takes hold in the 1980s, that shared cultural assumption is totally gone. We see the rise of the shareholder value movement. Management begins to view labor not as partners in a shared American project, but as a hostile cost center to be minimized, automated, or outsourced.
While simultaneously, organized labor loses its leverage as the economy shifts and globalization accelerates.
Exactly. The trust just evaporates. The idea that a vast corporation and a powerful union would lock arms for mutual long-term stability became a completely alien concept to the new leaders running those organizations.
It's a complete paradigm shift, and there is a specific cultural artifact from 1984 that captures this transition flawlessly. Ridley Scott directed a commercial for Apple that aired during the Super Bowl, and it is the absolute emblem of the third turning.
For those who haven't seen it, the imagery is just striking. It opens in this gray, dystopian auditorium. Hundreds of identical mind-controlled drones are marching in lockstep, staring blankly at a giant screen where a big brother figure is delivering a speech about conformity and unified resolve.
Then, this brightly colored, athletic young woman sprints down the center aisle holding a sledgehammer. Riot police are chasing her, but she rears back and hurls the sledgehammer directly into the screen.
It explodes in a blinding light.
Right, breaking the hypnosis of the drones. And the voiceover announces the arrival of the Macintosh computer, promising that 1984 won't be like George Orwell's 1984.
In the language of generational theory, the big brother figure isn't just a generic dictator. It represents the suffocating endpoint of the first turning's institutional consensus. It is the ultimate manifestation of the collective conformity that the younger generations had grown to absolutely despise.
The hero of the era is no longer the soldier in uniform marching in formation.
No. The hero is the rebel smashing the system with a sledgehammer. The computer itself transitions from being a room-sized mainframe controlled by the Pentagon or IBM into a personal computer, an instrument of pure individual liberation.
And the deep irony here is inescapable. Apple, the company that positioned itself as the colorful rebel destroying the gray monolith, eventually became the most valuable, ubiquitous corporate institution on the planet. But the ethos of the unraveling remains: smash the old structures to celebrate extreme individualism.
Howe and Strauss offer a pretty grim observation on this dynamic. When a society spends 2 decades celebrating the smashing of institutions, it eventually arrives at a point where there are no institutions left to protect it when the winter arrives.
That transition from collective building to individual consumption is summarized brilliantly by a mundane observation Howe and Strauss make about bumper stickers in the 1990s.
I love this example. They contrast 2 distinct slogans. The first belongs to the GI generation, the civic builders, as they entered their elder years. Their RVs often sported a bumper sticker reading, "We're spending our children's inheritance."
And then you have the baby boomers in their midlife peak earning years driving cars with a totally different sticker. He read, "Whoever dies with the most toys wins."
Just imagine driving behind those cars. Sociologically, both slogans reflect a radical abandonment of the future in favor of the present.
Right.
The elders are declaring that they built the wealth and intend to consume it rather than pass it down. And the midlifers are framing life as an individualistic game of material accumulation where the only scorecard is personal acquisition.
The entire culture is publicly advertising that long-term collective building is no longer the priority.
So what does this all mean for you today? We are sitting here in 2026. If the unraveling defined the period from 1984 to 2005, why are we dissecting it now? We must dissect it because the institutional decay that accumulated during the unraveling provides the exact raw material for the crisis we are currently navigating. In their framework, the fourth turning the crisis, or the winter, always follows the unraveling.
And Howe later updated his timeline on this, right?
He did. He suggested the 2008 financial crisis was the catalyst that officially ended the unraveling and initiated the current crisis, with 2020 serving as a major accelerant. Therefore, we are living deep inside the wreckage of the third turning right now.
Let's be specific about what was lost during that autumn period. We saw the erosion of trust in mainstream media, the collapse of functional bipartisan governance, the fracturing of shared cultural and moral assumptions, and the offshoring of significant domestic industrial capacity.
All of which was hollowed out in the pursuit of efficiency, deregulation, and personal autonomy.
This explains why the current landscape feels so utterly intractable. The very mechanisms required to manage a national or global crisis were dismantled during the previous phase. You cannot fight a brutal winter storm in a house where the roof was quietly sold for scrap during the autumn.
That's a brutal image, but it's accurate.
When a pandemic hits, or supply chains freeze, or geopolitical conflict erupts, a society desperately needs public trust, collective action, and industrial capacity. But we spent 20 years celebrating the destruction of those exact things.
This is where their work transitions from historical observation to prescriptive advice. In Chapter 11 of The Fourth Turning, they offer explicit guidance for individuals transitioning from the end of an unraveling into the depths of a crisis.
And what do they say to do?
They advise readers to shed unnecessary complexity, strengthen family bonds, diversify investments, build local community, and brace for the collapse of public support systems.
Read in isolation. That sounds like standard advice from a conservative financial planner. Diversify your portfolio and spend time with your kids. But viewed through the lens of the seculum, this 80-year cycle, it takes on a structurally urgent tone.
What's fascinating here is they are not suggesting you build local communities simply for your mental health. They are suggesting it because the macro-level support systems, federal safety nets, global supply chains, were fatally weakened during the unraveling.
They might literally snap.
Yes. They may lack the structural integrity to survive the pressure of a crisis. When those macro systems fail, your neighbors and your local municipality become your primary safety net.
Now, we promised to give you the full picture, and that means we have to pivot. We need to look at the limitations of this theory. We cannot just act as cheerleaders for an elegant historical model without testing its structural integrity. Where does this idea break down?
The most glaring vulnerability of the unraveling concept is the danger of retrospective rationalization.
Confirmation bias, basically.
Exactly. The kids these days trope is as old as recorded history. You can read the ancient Greeks complaining about the individualism and disrespect of the youth. The Victorians lamented the decay of traditional morals.
Every generation thinks the world is going to hell in a handbasket because things are different than when they were young.
And that means the theory struggles with falsifiability. For a framework to be scientifically robust, there must be a condition under which it could be proven wrong. But if you adopt the Strauss and Howe lens, you will find unravelings everywhere.
Because history is messy.
Right. You can select any random 20-year period in history, highlight the political corruption scandals, point to a few individualistic art movements, and declare it a structurally mandated third turning.
How do we prove that the decay of trust in the 1990s was driven by a mystical 80-year clock rather than just the logical, linear consequence of the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, and the economic shocks of the 1970s?
Which brings us to a major sociological debate. The core question for you to think about is this. Is the unraveling a unique, cyclical phenomenon tied to specific generational archetypes? Or is it simply the natural life cycle of any aging bureaucracy?
Let's frame the two sides of this debate so you can wrestle with it yourself. Side A is the Strauss and Howe position.
Side A argues for strict cyclical necessity. The unraveling must happen. It is mathematically baked into the timeline. They define 4 specific generational archetypes: the prophet, the nomad, the hero, and the artist.
Right.
They argue that as the prophet generation, like the boomers, and the nomad generation, like Gen X, move into midlife and leadership, they are archetypally programmed by their childhood experiences to tear down the institutions built by the previous hero generation. The unraveling is a required phase of the ecosystem, clearing the brush so new growth can occur in the next spring.
But then we have side B, which is heavily favored by the broader academic consensus.
Side B relies on scholars like Robert Putnam and Mankerolson. Let's look closely at Putnam. He published Bowling Alone in 2000, documenting a staggering decline in American social capital. He looked at the data for bowling leagues. Individual bowling was actually up, but league bowling had completely collapsed. People were bowling alone.
He tracked everything, didn't he?
Everything.
Yeah.
The decline in PTA memberships, union participation, church attendance, fraternal organizations. He documented the exact same collapse in civic engagement during the exact same period that Strauss and Howe call the Unraveling.
But Putnam didn't need a mystical secular clock to explain it.
He didn't. He pointed to television privatizing our leisure time, urban sprawl, physically separating communities, and the pressures of dual-income households reducing free time. It's a linear, material explanation.
And Menker-Olson's work does something similar for the economic side.
Yes. Olson's work on institutional sclerosis provides another non-cyclical explanation. Olson argued that as any stable democratic society ages, it naturally accumulates special interest groups.
The lobbyists, the guilds.
Exactly. Over time, these groups act like cholesterol in the arteries of the economy, slowing down decision-making, complicating tax codes, and making institutions bloated and unresponsive.
Olson is basically saying that an institution founded in 1945 is going to be inefficient and corrupted by 1995 just by the laws of bureaucratic physics. You don't need a profit archetype to explain why the DMV is slow.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the phenomenon of the unraveling is empirically real. The data showing the collapse of institutional trust between the 1960s and the 2000s is undeniable. The civic disengagement is measurable, but the mechanism driving it remains highly debated.
Is it a grand rotating cast of generational archetypes? Or is it the invention of the internet, the shift to a service economy, and standard institutional sclerosis?
Regardless of whether you subscribe to side A or side B, the reality of the ground we are standing on today is identical. We are in the winter dealing with the consequences of the autumn, and knowledge is only useful when it is applied. We need to move from theory to action.
I want to leave you with one concrete action step for your Monday morning. Based on the survival advice for navigating the end of an unraveling, challenge yourself to shed one unnecessary complexity or strengthen one local bond this week.
Make it practical.
Exactly. It could mean simplifying a fragile financial dependency, canceling a subscription that ties you to an unreliable digital ecosystem, or taking the time to actually introduce yourself to a neighbor you've lived next to for 3 years but never spoken to.
The rationale here is deeply pragmatic. If the macro systems hollowed out during the unraveling falter under the pressure of the current crisis, your immediate physical community and your lack of complex dependencies will serve as your most reliable safety net.
Finally, a provocative thought to chew on regarding the endowment cycle we talked about. Look closely at your own workplace, your industry, or your specific organization. Are there critical skills, unwritten rules of execution, or vital institutional muscle memories that are held entirely by the oldest cohort of workers in your office?
What happens to your organization's endowment when that specific group retires? Are those competencies being systematically transferred to the younger staff, or is your organization sleepwalking into its own private unraveling?
Where suddenly no one remembers how to execute the core functions that made the enterprise successful to begin with.
It's a terrifying question if you really look at your own company.
That was lesson 5 of 14 on The Fourth Turning, Generational Theory Across 3 Decades. Subscribe for the full series. If you haven't seen our debate overview of the whole book, check that out, link in the description. Thanks for being here. See you next time.